September 1944, somewhere in the Aegean Sea. Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell stood on the deck of the USS Helena, watching as the first group of Bulgarian prisoners shuffled aboard. Their uniforms were torn, their faces gaunt from months of inadequate supplies, and their eyes held that particular emptiness that comes from fighting a war you never believed in. What none of them knew, including Mitchell himself, was that the next 72 hours would fundamentally challenge everything these men understood about wealth, power, and what it meant to serve in a military force. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The question that would haunt historians for decades afterward was simple yet profound. How could a nation's entire understanding of its place in the world be overturned not by bombs or bullets, but by the contents of a tin can and a glimpse into a ship's galley? The answer lay not in grand strategy or political maneuvering, but in the stark, undeniable arithmetic of logistics that revealed more about American industrial might than 1,000 propaganda broadcasts ever could. The moment that set everything in motion had occurred 3 weeks earlier, when Bulgaria, reading the inevitable conclusion of the war, had switched sides and declared war on Germany. The transition was chaotic and messy, as such things always are. Bulgarian forces that had been fighting alongside German units suddenly found themselves in an impossible position. Some units surrendered to Soviet forces pushing through Romania, others, particularly naval personnel and coastal defenders stationed on Greek islands, found themselves isolated and surrounded by Allied forces. Among those was a company of approximately 200 Bulgarian soldiers garrisoning the small island of Tassos in the northern Aegean. When British and American naval forces arrived to accept their surrender on September 12, the Bulgarians had been without resupply for 6 weeks. Their rations had dwindled to nearly nothing. The men were surviving on whatever they could scavenge from the island's meager resources, supplemented by increasingly inadequate portions from their dwindling stores. The officer who accepted their surrender was James Mitchell, a 31-year-old naval officer from Portland, Maine, who had spent the previous 2 years commanding destroyer escorts in the Mediterranean. Mitchell had joined the Navy in 1935, not from any particular martial ambition, but because the Great Depression had left few other options for a young man with a high school education and no family connections. The Navy offered steady pay, 3 meals a day, and the possibility of learning a trade. For a kid whose father had lost everything in the bank failures of 1933, those were opportunities worth seizing. Mitchell's path to this moment had been shaped by circumstances beyond his control and choices made with limited information, much like the Bulgarian soldiers now under his temporary custody. Born on March 14, 1913, in a small fishing community outside Portland, James had grown up understanding scarcity. His father had been a fisherman who lost his boat when the banks collapsed. His mother had taken in laundry to keep the family fed. James and his 2 younger sisters learned early that nothing could be wasted, that every resource had value, and that hunger was not an abstract concept but a physical reality that could define your entire day. The Navy had been his escape and his education. He entered as a seaman recruit and quickly demonstrated aptitude for navigation and ship handling. He attended technical schools, earned promotions through a combination of competence and persistence, and by 1941 had achieved the rank of lieutenant. He had been stationed at Pearl Harbor on December 7, though his ship had been at sea during the attack, sparing him from the carnage that claimed so many of his fellow sailors. The war had accelerated everything. Mitchell's steady competence and his ability to remain calm under pressure had brought him through the chaos of those early desperate months when the Navy was trying to do too much with too little. He had served on convoy escort duty in the Atlantic, protecting merchant ships from U-boat attacks. He had participated in the North Africa landings, coordinating small craft movements during the assault on Oran. He had been in the Sicily invasion, and now, in September 1944, he found himself accepting the surrender of Bulgarian forces who looked at him with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The Bulgarians had expected prison camps, interrogations, and the uncertain future that came with being on the losing side of a war. What they got instead was something that would shake their understanding of the world far more profoundly than any punishment could have. Mitchell, following standard protocols for handling prisoners who had switched to the Allied side, had them brought aboard the Helena for transport to a larger facility where they could be properly processed, documented, and eventually repatriated or reassigned as the political situation clarified. The first moment of culture shock came during the initial feeding. Mitchell had ordered the ship's supply officer to issue standard field rations to the prisoners. These were sea rations, the basic combat field ration that every American soldier and sailor knew intimately. Each ration consisted of one M unit, the meat component, and one B unit, containing bread, dessert, and accessories. The M unit might contain meat and beans, meat and vegetable hash, or meat and spaghetti. The B unit included crackers, candy, cigarettes, matches, chewing gum, toilet paper, and water purification tablets. To American servicemen, sea rations were the subject of endless complaints and bitter jokes. They were considered barely adequate, monotonous to the point of torture, and representative of everything unsatisfying about military life. Soldiers and sailors had been griping about them since their introduction in 1938, and the complaints had only intensified as the war dragged on. The running joke was that the C and C ration stood for cardboard, though more colorful descriptions were common in barracks and mess halls across every theater of operation. When the Bulgarian prisoners received their C rations, Mitchell expected grateful acceptance or perhaps indifferent acknowledgement. What he did not expect was laughter. The Bulgarians, examining the tins and packages, began to chuckle among themselves. The laughter grew louder as they opened the containers and saw the contents. Several prisoners made comments in Bulgarian that their interpreter, a Greek-American sailor named Constantine Papandreou, translated with obvious discomfort. One Bulgarian sergeant, a man named Dmitry Petrov who spoke some German that Mitchell could understand, examined the meat and beans ration with obvious amusement and said through the interpreter that this was the kind of food Bulgarian officers might receive as a special treat on holidays. Another prisoner, looking at the candy bar included in his ration, held it up and announced to his fellows that the Americans must think they were children, giving them sweets like this. The general sentiment, as Papandreou translated with increasing awkwardness, was that the prisoners found it simultaneously amusing and insulting that the Americans would try to impress them with such obvious propaganda. The Bulgarians believed the rations were staged, a psychological operation designed to make American military capability seem greater than it actually was. They assumed these were special rations, perhaps reserved for officers or provided specifically to mislead prisoners. The idea that ordinary American servicemen received such rations as standard issue seemed too absurd to credit. In the Bulgarian army, ordinary soldiers received black bread, thin soup, and occasionally a bit of preserved meat or cheese. Fresh vegetables were rare. Chocolate was something you might see once a year if you were lucky.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The idea that common soldiers routinely received such items was beyond their experience. Mitchell found himself in an unexpected position. He was not particularly political, not given to propaganda or attempts to convert anyone to American ideology. He was a practical man who had spent 9 years in the Navy learning to manage resources, handle personnel and complete assigned missions with minimum fuss. But the Bulgarians' reaction stirred something in him, a realization that the gap between their experience and his was so vast that they literally could not recognize reality when they saw it. He decided on a course of action that was not in any manual or standard procedure. That evening, as the Helena continued its patrol, Mitchell arranged for the Bulgarian prisoners to be given a tour of the ship's galley during the evening meal preparation for the crew. He wanted them to see what American sailors actually ate on a routine basis, not as propaganda but as simple fact. What he did not anticipate was how profoundly this experience would affect not just the prisoners but his own understanding of the war he had been fighting. The Helena's chief cook was a man named Samuel Washington, a 42-year-old career Navy man from Louisiana, who had been cooking on naval vessels since 1922. Washington ran his galley with absolute authority and considerable pride. He had served on battleships, cruisers and destroyers, had cooked through storms that sent pots flying and fires that threatened to consume his kitchen, and he maintained standards that would have impressed many civilian restaurant operators. When Mitchell explained what he wanted to do, Washington's initial reaction was suspicion. He did not like having prisoners in his galley, did not like disrupting his routine, and did not see the point of the exercise. But Mitchell explained his reasoning, and Washington, after a long moment of consideration, agreed with one condition: the prisoners would see everything exactly as it was, with no special preparations or attempts to make things look better than normal. If they were going to do this, Washington insisted it would be authentic. That evening, as the ship's crew began assembling for dinner, Mitchell brought a group of 20 Bulgarian prisoners, including Sergeant Petrov and several other non-commissioned officers, down to observe the galley operations. What they saw left them speechless. Washington and his 3 cooks were preparing the evening meal for the Helena's crew of approximately 300 officers and enlisted men. The menu that night, as posted on the galley board, consisted of roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, butter, coffee, and apple pie for dessert. The Bulgarians watched in stunned silence as Washington carved roasts that had been cooking for hours. They saw potatoes being mashed with real butter and milk. They observed green beans, not from cans but from the ship's stores where vegetables were kept as fresh as possible for as long as possible. They saw loaves of bread that had been baked that morning in the ship's ovens. And they saw pies, actual pies with crust and filling, being prepared for dessert. Sergeant Petrov, watching this preparation, turned to Mitchell and asked through Papandreou if this was a special meal for officers. Mitchell shook his head and explained that this was the standard evening meal for the entire crew. Every sailor on the ship, from the lowest-ranking seaman to the captain himself, would eat this same meal in the same mess hall. Petrov's face showed disbelief. He asked if this was because they were in port or celebrating something. Mitchell explained that the Helena had been at sea for 12 days and would remain at sea for at least another week. This was routine shipboard feeding. The Bulgarian prisoners began asking questions through the interpreter, their voices taking on an edge that Mitchell recognized as the sound of men whose fundamental assumptions were being challenged. How often did the crew eat like this? 3 times a day, Mitchell explained, with breakfast typically consisting of eggs, bacon or sausage, toast, fruit and coffee, lunch involving sandwiches, soup and more substantial fare, and dinner being the fullest meal of the day. Did the officers eat better food? No, Mitchell explained. Everyone ate the same food, though officers ate in a separate mess and senior officers might have slightly more elaborate preparation of the same ingredients. One Bulgarian private, a young man perhaps 19 or 20 years old, asked a question that Papandreou seemed reluctant to translate. When Mitchell pressed him, the interpreter explained that the soldier wanted to know if American sailors understood that they were eating better than Bulgarian officers, better even than many Bulgarian civilians before the war. Mitchell had no answer for that. It had never occurred to him to think about his meals in those terms. Food was simply what appeared in the mess hall 3 times a day, something you ate without thinking about much beyond whether you liked the particular dish being served. Washington, who had been listening to this exchange while supervising his cooks, spoke up. He told Mitchell to ask the prisoners what they had been eating before their surrender. The answers, translated by Papandreou, painted a picture of deprivation that shocked even Washington, who had grown up poor in rural Louisiana during the Depression. The Bulgarian soldiers described rations that had dwindled over months from inadequate to nearly non-existent. Black bread that was more sawdust than flour, soup that was mostly water with a few vegetables, meat perhaps once a week, and then only small portions of poor quality, no sugar, no coffee, no chocolate, nothing that could be considered a luxury or even a comfort. Washington looked at Mitchell and said something that would stick with the lieutenant commander for the rest of his life. He said that he had always known America was rich compared to most places, but he had never really understood what that meant until this moment. He had complained about Navy food for 20 years, had groused about tough meat and bland vegetables and coffee that tasted like bilge water. But seeing these men's faces as they watched routine meal preparation, he realized that his complaints had been about the difference between good and excellent, while their experience was the difference between barely surviving and actually living. The Bulgarian prisoners were invited to eat with the crew that evening. Mitchell had cleared this with the ship's captain, Commander Robert Hayes, who was curious about the experiment and willing to allow it under controlled conditions. The prisoners were seated in a section of the enlisted mess, with American sailors at nearby tables maintaining security through simple presence rather than overt guarding. The Bulgarians received the same portions as the American crew, served on the same metal trays, eaten with the same utensils. What followed was a meal that everyone present would remember for different reasons. The American sailors, initially wary of eating alongside enemy soldiers, even ones who had surrendered, gradually relaxed as they observed the prisoners' reactions. The Bulgarians ate slowly, almost reverently, examining each component of their meal as if trying to memorize it. Several of them openly wept. Sergeant Petrov, sitting across from a young American sailor named Robert Chen, asked through improvised gestures and broken German how often Chen had eaten meals like this before joining the Navy. Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, thought about the question and answered honestly. His family had not been wealthy. His father worked in a cannery, his mother took in sewing, but yes, he acknowledged, meals at home had generally included meat, vegetables and bread. Perhaps not every day, and certainly the portions had been smaller during the worst of the Depression, but this kind of food was not unusual. It was normal. Chen realized as he said this how extraordinary that normalcy must sound to someone whose experience was so different. The conversation spread across the mess hall through interpreters and hand gestures and broken multilingual attempts at communication. American sailors found themselves trying to explain their lives to men who could barely comprehend what they were hearing. A sailor from Iowa described growing up on a farm where they had always had enough to eat, where the problem had been not scarcity but low prices that made farming unprofitable. A sailor from New York talked about breadlines during the Depression but acknowledged that even in those desperate times he had never gone days without eating. A sailor from Texas mentioned that his family had been poor, genuinely poor, but that poor in America apparently meant something different than poor in Bulgaria. The Bulgarians asked about American fargers, American cities. They asked how a country could produce enough food to feed soldiers like this while also fighting a war on multiple continents. They asked whether America had suffered damage from bombing like European nations had. When told that the American mainland had never been bombed, that American cities and farms and factories continued operating undamaged, several prisoners simply fell silent, unable to process information that contradicted everything their understanding of warfare implied. After the meal, Mitchell returned the prisoners to their temporary holding area, a section of the ship that had been converted for their accommodation. He expected the men would sleep after having eaten their first full meal in weeks. Instead, he found them awake late into the night, talking among themselves in animated discussions that Papandreou, monitoring from a distance, reported were attempts to reconcile what they had seen with what they believed about the world. The next morning brought another revelation. Breakfast service began at 0600 hours with the smell of cooking bacon drifting through the ship. Mitchell had not planned to continue the prisoners' exposure to American naval life, but several Bulgarian soldiers asked through their guards if they could observe the morning meal preparation. Mitchell, after consulting with Commander Hayes, agreed. If they were going to do this, they might as well do it thoroughly. Washington and his crew prepared breakfast for 300 men with the same efficiency they brought to every meal. Eggs were fried or scrambled according to preference. Bacon sizzled on griddles. Toast was made by the dozens of slices. Coffee, that black bitter liquid that was the Navy's true fuel, brewed in enormous quantities. Fresh fruit, oranges that had been brought aboard at the last port call, were distributed. Pancakes appeared for those who wanted them, with syrup and butter available for topping. The Bulgarian prisoners watched this abundance with faces that cycled through disbelief, confusion, and something that Mitchell finally recognized as grief. They were grieving for what they had never had, for what their families and communities had never had, for an existence so different from their own that they had not known enough to imagine it. One older Bulgarian soldier, a man who must have been in his 40s and had probably fought in the previous war, asked Mitchell through Papandreou a question that cut to the heart of everything. Did Mitchell understand that what he considered normal was something these men had never experienced and likely never would again? Once they left this ship, Mitchell had no good answer. He was beginning to understand that his entire life, everything he had considered ordinary or even disappointing, represented a level of material security and abundance that was extraordinary by global standards. He had grown up poor by American standards, had known hunger during the worst Depression years, had worn second-hand clothes and gone without things his classmates took for granted. But even that poverty had been fundamentally different from what these men knew. His poverty had been relative deprivation within an abundant system. Theirs was absolute scarcity in a system that produced barely enough to survive. Over the following 2 days, as the Helena continued its patrol before delivering the prisoners to a larger facility, Mitchell found himself having conversations that changed his understanding of the war and his place in it. Sergeant Petrov, who spoke the best German among the prisoners and could communicate somewhat effectively with Mitchell, became an informal spokesman for the Bulgarian soldier. Petrov was 34 years old, had been a school teacher before the war, and possessed the kind of analytical mind that could not help but try to understand what he was experiencing. Petrov told Mitchell about Bulgaria's entry into the war, how the country had joined the Axis, not from any ideological commitment but from geographic and political necessity. Surrounded by German power and threatened by Soviet expansion, Bulgaria had chosen what seemed the safer path. Most Bulgarians, Petrov insisted, had no hatred for Americans or British. They barely understood why they were fighting at all, except that their government had made a deal and soldiers followed orders. When the chance came to switch sides, many Bulgarians had felt relief rather than betrayal. But what Petrov and his men were experiencing aboard the Helena was more destabilizing than any battlefield defeat. Petrov explained that Bulgarian propaganda had insisted that America was weak, that its wealth was superficial, that its military was poorly supplied and dependent on British support. The reality of American logistical capability, visible in something as simple as ship's galley, demolished those claims completely. If America could feed its sailors this well while fighting a global war, what else might be true that Bulgarian propaganda had denied? Mitchell asked Petrov what he thought would happen when the prisoners returned home and told people what they had seen. Petrov considered this carefully before answering. He said that some would believe them, particularly those who had already doubted the government's narrative. Others would dismiss their accounts as exaggeration or brainwashing. But the seed would be planted, the knowledge that somewhere in the world, ordinary people lived with an abundance that Bulgarians could barely imagine. That knowledge, Petrov suggested, could not be erased. It would persist, would spread, would eventually corrode whatever remained of the old certainties. On the third day aboard the Helena, just before the prisoners were to be transferred to a transport ship for movement to a proper prisoner facility, Washington approached Mitchell with an unusual request. He wanted to give the prisoners provisions to take with them, not the standard sea rations but actual supplies from the ship's stores: coffee, sugar, canned fruit, chocolate bars, cigarettes, things that sailors traded and valued but that the Navy provided in sufficient quantity that a small distribution would not be missed. Mitchell knew this violated probably a dozen regulations regarding prisoner property and resource distribution, but he also understood what Washington was offering. These were not supplies being given to an enemy but care packages being offered to men who had become in some strange way witnesses to a truth that needed witnessing. Mitchell approved the distribution, accepting responsibility for the breach of procedure. When the prisoners prepared to leave the Helena, each man received a small bag of supplies. The Bulgarians accepted these gifts with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment that made clear they still did not fully believe what they had experienced. Several prisoners shook hands with American sailors, an act that just days before would have been unthinkable. Sergeant Petrov sought out Mitchell for a final conversation. Through Papandreou, he told the lieutenant commander that he had learned more about the nature of the war in 3 days aboard this ship than in 2 years of fighting it. He said that he now understood they had been on the wrong side, not because of ideology or moral failing, but because they had allied with poverty against abundance, with scarcity against plenty. Mitchell watched the prisoners board the transport ship that would carry them to the processing facility. He felt a profound sense of disconnection, as if the previous 72 hours had occurred in some separate reality that did not quite mesh with the world he had known before. He had conducted what military historians would later call an inadvertent psychological operation, though that term would not be coined for years. He had demonstrated American power not through weapons or threats, but through the simple abundance that his nation could provide to its ordinary servicemen. Commander Hayes called Mitchell to his quarters that evening after the prisoners had been transferred. Hayes had observed the entire situation and wanted to debrief his subordinate. He asked Mitchell what he thought the experience had accomplished. Mitchell struggled to articulate it but finally said that he thought they had revealed something true about the war that was rarely acknowledged. This was not primarily a conflict of ideologies or political systems. It was a war between industrial economies at vastly different levels of productive capability. The side that could feed its soldiers, supply its ships, maintain its equipment, and still have surplus capacity for expansion would win. The mathematics were inevitable once you understood the underlying production differentials. Hayes nodded thoughtfully and shared something that Mitchell had not known. The captain had been keeping track of the Helena's supply consumption and had noticed something interesting. Feeding 200 Bulgarian prisoners for 3 days at the same level as the crew had required less than a 2% increase in supply usage. The ship's stores, designed to feed 300 men for 30 days, could easily accommodate the additional load. But those same rations, distributed to Bulgarian forces, would have represented weeks of food for a unit of similar size. The productivity gap between American and Bulgarian military logistics was so vast that what amounted to rounding error in American calculations represented substantial resources from the Bulgarian perspective. This conversation led Mitchell to begin asking questions he had never considered before. Where did the food come from that fed the Navy's ships? He learned that the United States was producing agricultural surpluses even while exporting massive quantities of food to allies under Lend-Lease. How could factories produce both civilian goods and military equipment simultaneously? He learned that American industrial capacity had expanded so dramatically during the war that production of consumer goods, while reduced, had never stopped entirely. How could the government afford to wage war on such a massive scale? He learned about deficit financing, industrial mobilization, and economic management on a scale that would have seemed like fantasy before the Depression forced new thinking about government's role in the economy. The more Mitchell learned, the more he realized that the Bulgarian prisoners' incomprehension was entirely. They had encountered something genuinely outside their experience, a form of economic organization that produced abundance as its default output rather than scarcity. The United States in 1944 was not just wealthy, it was wealthy in a particular way that concentrated productive capacity to an extraordinary degree. Other nations had resources and skills, but American advantages in industrial infrastructure, agricultural productivity, transportation networks, and organizational systems created compounding returns that multiplied the effective value of every input. Mitchell began to see his own life differently. His childhood poverty, real as it had been, existed within a system that provided public schools, public libraries, roads, electricity expanding into rural areas, and a baseline of public health infrastructure that prevented the kind of catastrophic collapse visible in less developed economies. His naval career had trained him in technical skills using equipment and methods that represented the cutting edge of organizational efficiency. His ship, the Helena, was itself a technological marvel that would have been impossible to build or operate without the vast industrial and educational infrastructure that produced both the vessel and the trained personnel to crew it. The Bulgarian prisoners had laughed at sea rations because they assumed American propaganda was trying to impress them with mediocre food presented as luxury. They had been shocked by the ship's galley because they encountered actual abundance that their experience had not prepared them to recognize. The contrast revealed something profound about relative capabilities that military force comparisons alone could not capture. You could count ships, aircraft, tanks, and soldiers, but if you did not understand the logistics that sustained them, you missed the essential arithmetic of modern warfare. The weeks following the prisoner transfer brought unexpected consequences that rippled through military channels in ways Mitchell never anticipated. Reports of the incident reached naval intelligence, who saw potential value in what had occurred. A full debriefing was ordered, and Mitchell found himself explaining to officers in Cairo how showing Bulgarian prisoners a ship's galley had accidentally created more effective propaganda than any intentional effort could have achieved. The intelligence officers were particularly interested in Sergeant Petrov's comments about how the experience would affect prisoners once they returned home. One captain, a man named Douglas Werner who specialized in psychological operations, told Mitchell that material demonstration of capability was worth more than 1,000 leaflets or radio broadcasts. People could dismiss words as lies, but they could not dismiss the physical reality of food they had eaten and abundance they had witnessed firsthand. Werner explained that the Allied command had been struggling with how to communicate the futility of continued Axis resistance to populations who had been fed years of propaganda. Traditional methods had limited effect because people naturally distrusted information from enemy sources. But prisoners returning home with first-hand accounts of American logistical capability provided a vector for truth that propaganda could not replicate. These men would tell their families, their friends, their communities what they had seen. Some would be believed. Those beliefs would spread. Mitchell learned that similar incidents had occurred elsewhere, though none quite as systematic as what had happened aboard the Helena. Italian prisoners working in American port facilities had been astonished by the casual waste they observed, equipment discarded because repair was more trouble than replacement. German prisoners in Britain had been shocked by the rations provided in POW camps, which exceeded what German soldiers received on active duty. Japanese prisoners in the Pacific had struggled to comprehend the sheer volume of supplies American forces transported and consumed. What made the Helena incident noteworthy was that it had been observed and documented in real time, with the prisoners' reactions recorded through interpreter reports. Werner asked if Mitchell would be willing to have similar encounters organized systematically with other prisoner groups. Mitchell hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea of turning routine shipboard life into calculated propaganda. But he also recognized that what the Bulgarian prisoners had experienced was simply truth. If showing people reality constituted propaganda, then perhaps the distinction between information and manipulation was more complex than he had thought. The matter was resolved when Mitchell received new orders transferring him to a destroyer escort conducting anti-submarine operations in the Adriatic. He left the psychological operations questions to others and returned to the more straightforward business of hunting submarines and protecting convoys. But the memory of those 3 days stayed with him, coloring his understanding of the war and his place in it. Samuel Washington continued running the Helena's galley with the same exacting standards he had maintained for 2 decades. But something had changed for him as well. He found himself thinking about the young Bulgarian private who had wept while eating apple pie and wondering what kind of life that soldier would return to when the war ended. Washington had grown up in poverty that most Americans considered severe, had known hunger and deprivation that left marks on his character, but he had never known the kind of systemic scarcity that made a simple meal seem like a miracle. Washington began writing letters to his sister in Louisiana, letters that tried to articulate what he had learned from the experience. He wrote about abundance and poverty, about how wealth was not just having more but having enough that you stopped thinking about scarcity entirely. He wrote about how he had spent 20 years complaining about Navy food without understanding how fortunate he was to have the option of complaining. His sister saved those letters, and decades later they would be discovered by a historian researching ordinary servicemen's experiences during the war. The Bulgarian prisoners were eventually repatriated after the war ended, processed through displaced persons camps and sent home to a country that had been devastated by conflict and would soon fall under Soviet domination. What happened to most of them remains unknown, their stories lost in the chaos of post-war reconstruction and communist takeover. But Sergeant Dmitry Petrov's fate was documented because of an unusual series of coincidences that brought his story back into American awareness decades later. Petrov returned to Bulgaria in late 1945 and resumed his teaching career in Sofia. He never spoke publicly about his time aboard the Helena, recognizing that such stories would be dangerous under the new communist regime that insisted on portraying America as a failing capitalist system on the verge of collapse. But he told his family, and he told trusted friends, and those stories spread through the underground networks of people who remembered a different world and refused to accept the official narrative completely. In 1956, during the brief thaw following Stalin's death, Petrov participated in demonstrations calling for reform in Bulgaria. The movement was crushed, and Petrov was arrested and imprisoned for 6 months. After his release, he was forbidden from teaching and worked as a translator until his retirement. He lived to see communism collapse in 1989, dying in 1992 at age 82. Among his papers, his children found a diary he had kept secretly for decades, including detailed entries about his 3 days aboard the American destroyer Escort in September 1944. Petrov's diary was eventually published in Bulgaria in 1995 as part of a collection of wartime memoirs. A copy made its way to a Bulgarian-American scholar at Georgetown University who translated portions and published them in a journal article about material culture and military effectiveness. The article caught the attention of a naval historian who tracked down the ship's logs and determined that the vessel was indeed the USS Helena and that the officer mentioned was James Mitchell. Mitchell had left the Navy in 1946 as a full commander, returning to Portland where he used GI Bill benefits to attend college and eventually became a high school teacher. He married, raised 3 children and lived a quiet life that gave no indication of any particular historical significance. When the naval historian contacted him in 1997, Mitchell was 84 years old and living in a retirement. He remembered the incident clearly but had never considered it particularly noteworthy amid all the other experiences of his naval service. The historian interviewed Mitchell extensively, drawing out details and context that Mitchell had never articulated even to his own family. Mitchell spoke about how that brief encounter with the Bulgarian prisoners had changed his understanding of American power and global inequality. He described how it had made him think differently about his own life and opportunities. He reflected on how strange it was that something as mundane as a ship's galley could reveal truths about economic systems and national capabilities that political speeches obscured. Mitchell died in 1998 shortly after the interviews were completed. The historian published a book in 2001 titled The Arithmetic of Abundance, Material Culture and American Military Power in World War II that devoted an entire chapter to the Helena incident. The book argued that American victory in World War II resulted not primarily from superior strategy or tactics, though those mattered, but from overwhelming logistical and industrial advantages that multiplied the effectiveness of every strategic and tactical decision. The core thesis was that modern warfare had become fundamentally an industrial and organizational challenge rather than primarily a military one. The side that could produce more, transport more, supply more, and waste more while still maintaining surplus capacity would inevitably prevail over opponents who had to husband every resource carefully. The Bulgarian prisoners' reaction to American naval rations illustrated this principle more clearly than any statistical analysis of production figures could convey. The book received mixed reviews from military historians, some of whom felt it overstated economic factors while understating human elements like leadership, morale, and tactical skill, but it influenced a generation of scholars who began examining warfare through the lens of logistics and material culture rather than focusing exclusively on battles and command decisions. The Helena incident became a standard case study in courses on military history and international relations, used to illustrate how relative economic capabilities shaped conflict outcomes. The broader implications of what those Bulgarian prisoners experienced went beyond military history. Their encounter with American abundance represented a microcosm of the larger encounter between different economic systems that would define the post-war world. The Cold War that followed World War II was often portrayed as an ideological conflict between capitalism and communism, freedom and tyranny. But beneath the ideological rhetoric lay a simpler reality visible in that ship's galley in September 1944. One system produced abundance as its default output, generating surplus capacity that allowed for waste, experimentation, and continuous improvement. The other system managed scarcity, rationing limited resources and prioritizing subsistence over comfort. The competition between these systems was never primarily about which had better ideas or more inspiring rhetoric. It was about which could provide more material security and opportunity to ordinary people. The Bulgarian prisoners, laughing at sea rations and then shocked by fresh roast beef, had witnessed the answer before the question was fully formed. The incident also revealed something about the nature of propaganda and truth in wartime. Both sides engaged in extensive information operations designed to shape perceptions and maintain morale. But the most effective propaganda was not the carefully crafted messages distributed through official channels. It was the lived reality that people experienced directly and could not rationalize away. The Bulgarian prisoners could dismiss American radio broadcasts as lies. They could not dismiss the food they had eaten or the abundance they had witnessed. This created a challenge for authoritarian regimes that became increasingly acute as the 20th century progressed. Control of information became more difficult as direct contact between populations increased. Soldiers who had served abroad brought back experiences that contradicted official narratives. Refugees and immigrants carried memories of different living standards. Trade and travel exposed people to material realities that propaganda could not fully obscure. The gap between official narrative and lived experience created cognitive dissonance that eventually corroded legitimacy. The Helena incident, small as it was, represented the kind of encounter that multiplied across thousands of interactions during and after the war. Each encounter was a data point, a piece of evidence that accumulated into an understanding that transcended any single message or experience. Collectively, these encounters communicated a truth about relative capabilities and living standards that shaped the post-war world as much as any diplomatic agreement or military alliance. For the individuals involved, the experience carried different meanings. Mitchell came to understand his own life as existing within a system of abundance that he had taken for granted. Washington gained perspective on his complaints about food quality and recognized privilege in what he had considered merely adequate. The Bulgarian prisoners learned that their understanding of normal was not universal, that somewhere else people lived with a material security they could barely imagine. These personal transformations, multiplied across millions of similar encounters, created the human foundation for the post-war order. The United States emerged from World War II not just as a military victor but as a model of material abundance that people around the world aspired to emulate or access. That position was not achieved through propaganda or coercion, but through the simple reality of productive capacity so vast that even the military's routine logistics impressed those who witnessed it. The mathematics of supreme power in the modern world were calculated not in battlefield victories alone but in the unglamorous arithmetic of production, distribution, and consumption. A nation that could feed its sailors fresh roast beef and apple pie while fighting a global war possessed advantages that transcended military force. The Bulgarian prisoners who laughed at sea rations and then fell silent in a ship's galley had encountered those advantages directly, and their reaction revealed truths about power that politics obscured. Years later, historians analyzing the Cold War's outcome pointed to military spending, technological competition, and ideological appeal as decisive factors. But perhaps the simplest explanation was visible in that mess hall in September 1944. One side could provide abundance to ordinary people, the other could not. Everything else followed from that fundamental differential. The prisoners who witnessed it understood something that took political leaders decades to fully acknowledge: the competition was never equal. It only appeared so when you focused on weapons and ignored the logistics that sustained them. Mitchell, in his final interview before his death, reflected on what the experience had taught him. He said that power in the modern world came not from the ability to destroy but from the capacity to build and sustain. Military force remained important, but it was derivative of underlying economic and organizational capabilities. A nation that could produce enough to feed its soldiers well, supply its ships adequately, and maintain surplus capacity for civilian consumption possessed strategic advantages that mere militarists could not overcome. He noted that the Bulgarian prisoners had learned this lesson in 3 days aboard a single ship. It had taken him longer to fully grasp the implications, and many people never understood it at all. But once you saw it clearly, once you understood how abundance shaped strategic possibilities, you could not unsee it. The world looked different, conflicts took on new dimensions, the future became more predictable because the underlying arithmetic was easier to read. The Helena incident represented one small moment in a vast conflict, easily overlooked amid the grand strategic movements and dramatic battles that captured historical attention. But small moments sometimes revealed large truths. A group of prisoners laughing at field rations, then standing silent in a ship's galley, had encountered a reality that explained more about the war's outcome than many more famous events. They had seen the arithmetic of abundance, and they had understood, perhaps for the first time, what they were actually fighting against. The final irony was that the encounter had been entirely accidental. Mitchell had not planned to demonstrate American power. Washington had not intended to make a political statement. They had simply shown prisoners what existed, and that simple truth had accomplished what elaborate propaganda could not. Sometimes the most effective messages were the ones delivered without any attempt at messaging at all, when reality spoke for itself so clearly that no interpretation was required. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.